Hello. I just wanted to take a minute to explain the Basement Lab podcast. So, the Basement Lab podcast is my um, kind of my baby. I listen to podcasts all the time. I used to be an avid reader, but with being in grad school for the last 5 years, you really don't have time to read much outside what you're doing for work. So I started listening to audible books and podcasts a lot, and have taken in a lot of information that way. Really learned to enjoy them. So I've actually kind of wanted to get in on that game, and I have a background in education, so that to me has always seemed like a really fun way of disseminating information. Um, anyway, the Basement Lab podcast came about as um, basically research seems exciting. Being a scientist seems exciting, and at times it really is. But there's a whole lot of boring in between while you're waiting for experiments to run, or you don't have funding for an experiment, so you're writing grants or trying to scrounge up money to be able to run those experiments. Or even just when you're reading and writing and doing all of your stats and you just need a break. And it happens. You can become brain dead within an hour on certain days, depending on how hard the math is or the science that you're reading, how dense it is. So I noticed that a lot of people in my lab would just end up talking. And a lot of times we talk about science things, and sometimes we just talked about general nerdy things. Sometimes we just talked about the Monday Night Football game, or Game 7 of the World Series. Or other times we were like, oh, I just got this new comic book, let's like, have you read it? Yeah. Oh, okay, what did you think about this? And I noticed that a lot of times those conversations were pretty interesting and fun, and I decided, a lot of people don't exactly know what scientists do. And so the Basement Lab podcast is kind of a way of humanizing scientists and science. We're people just like everyone else. We have interests just like everyone else. Um, we like music, we like art, we like sports, we like movies and books. We are just as interested in the newest scientific discoveries as anyone else, so we talk about them. But I thought this would be a great way of humanizing scientists and science, as well as a lot of times getting some information out there. So you notice we have categories all across the board, whether we talk about comic books or movies or a scientific discussion or even just some interviews with people about topics. Um, I thought, that would be kind of interesting. You notice the format is really just us recording a conversation. A lot of these are not exceptionally well scripted. We might have some sort of structure just to keep us on task, but they're not scripted at all. We will make mistakes in our science because they're not scripted. We don't necessarily go out and write everything down. We try to do the best we can, remembering the facts off the top of our head or what we just know. But sometimes we have mistakes. If we do educational videos or podcasts, then we definitely will make sure the facts are correct. But in our discussions, we can't say with 100% that they are always correct. I know we've made a mistake or two in some previous episodes. It happens. But we are, you know, just recording these in single sessions. Very little editing. A lot of times I will edit out our ums or our pauses while we're thinking about a topic. Occasionally we get off track and I might edit that out, but there's very little editing that I actually do on these videos. Um, and, the people that are in these, a lot of us are grad students, scientists. We do have some professionals from a variety of topics that will pertain to what we're discussing at the time. So you can expect hopefully a varied base of people to help explain things and keep us from being too microscopic about what we're talking about and our viewpoints of it. But anyway, I'm hoping you enjoy the Basement Lab podcast. We have several items on the docket for future discussions. And like I said, a lot of times we decide on some topics for discussion and we read, primary literature when we can about it. We read a lot of secondary literature about the topics. If they're going to be scientific, we read a lot of primary and secondary literature. But again, we don't memorize it and we don't have those papers in front of us for the podcast. It's discussions. If it's a comic book, we all try to read it within a week or two before we record. Same for a movie. We try to watch it within a week or two before we record. But again, a lot of times these are not structured, scheduled events. We'll be like, oh, we have an hour, you have an hour, you have an hour, cool, we're going to talk about this and record it. A few other times we do like, hey, we're going to come in on Sunday and talk about this movie or this comic book. And that kind of helps with structure of knowing when to watch or read it. But hopefully this is somewhat beneficial to you on understanding what the Basement Lab podcast is. If you have topics, please let us know. We will definitely try to talk about them. Remember, most of us are either biologists or ecologists. We do have access to historians and sociologists and chemists and physicists, but we will not always have access to them, and there are a lot of topics that we may not be able to cover. But we will always try to get anything that people suggest in. And remember, it doesn't have to be science. It can be a comic book, a movie, a book, pop culture event. We just try to stay away from politics. A big part because we can definitely get in trouble for talking about politics as scientists, which is unfortunate because we are American citizens as well. We are world citizens as well. We should be allowed to have our voice, but people will absolutely come after us and funding if we talk about politics in a way they don't like, and that's on both sides of the aisle. So just keep that in mind. If it's really political, we will try not to talk about it. I think the one exception there will be climate change because we can't avoid it. So we're ecologists. We have to talk about climate change. It's happening. It's the one thing that we're like, even if it's political, we will talk about it. That being said, really appreciate you guys for tuning in. My name's Jordan, so you can put a face to the voice if you don't know exactly who everyone is. And the Basement Lab podcast was my basement lab, just talking about things and deciding to record them. So that's why it's called the Basement Lab podcast. But anyway, thank you for your time.